All right, so this week, you guys have really gotten us thinking with all the stuff you sent in about like how we figure out which kids are super bright and how they get into those, those really competitive, specialized programs.
Hmm.
And going through it all, it's become pretty clear that there's a big difference between just saying, hey, this kid's got something special, and then the whole often pretty crazy process of getting them into a program that's specifically for gifted kids. It's like more complicated than just finding the ones with the highest scores on some test.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And I think to really wrap our heads around this, we have to kind of step back and realize that even what we mean by giftedness is, well, it's not this simple fixed thing. It really boils down to what qualities we as a society or even just specific programs think are the most important.
Yeah.
And that's all tied up with like our fundamental ideas about what intelligence actually is.
Okay, yeah, let's break that down a bit because your sources highlighted three programs that are all about selecting gifted kids, but they're so different. You've got the Cisco A. Carter Gifted Early Education Program, which works with preschoolers in inner city Newark, and they look at both general smarts and specific talents. Then there's the Gilliard Pre-College Program, which is laser focused on one thing, being amazing at music. And then you've got Hunter College Elementary School, which seems to mostly be about finding kids who have that general intellectual giftedness.
You got it. And the whole point of this deep dive is to really get a handle on how all these different ideas about intelligence, the theories behind them, actually shape how these programs decide who gets in.
Right.
We also need to think about some of the bigger picture stuff,
Yeah.
like is there a best age to figure out if a kid might be gifted, and how do we make sure we're not missing bright kids from all sorts of different backgrounds?
Okay, so first things first. These theories of intelligence. It seems like there are a few main ways people have tried to explain what intelligence is.
Yeah, you can basically group the theories into three main buckets. First, you've got what's called G theory, where G stands for general intelligence. Thinkers like Bert, Jensen, and Spearman, they were all about this idea that there's this one underlying ability that we're kind of born with, and it pretty much stays the same. And they thought this one ability affects how well we do on all sorts of mental tasks.
Okay.
Like imagine it as this powerful engine driving everything. So if a program's working with this G theory, they're going to be all about those IQ scores, believing that one number tells you the most about how a kid will do in school overall, no matter what their specific talents might be. And this way of thinking says that because intelligence is like inborn, it doesn't really change that much. You can't really, significantly develop it.
So, in that view, a high IQ basically meant you had a lot of this G and were therefore gifted. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, at least on the surface. But then you've got the second group, the specific skills theories. And that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, that sounds totally different.
It is. These theories, guys like Thorndike, Thurstone, and Guilford, they saw intelligence not as one big thing, but more like a bunch of separate abilities. So you could be insanely good at something like, I don't know, playing the piano, but not so great at, say, math problems.
Right.
And they tried to like break down intelligence into all these different pieces. Guilford even suggested there could be like 120 different intellectual abilities. The main takeaway here is that being good at one thing doesn't automatically mean you're good at another. There's not really a connection between them.
Okay, so it's not one big engine. It's more like, I don't know, a toolbox with a ton of different tools.
Exactly.
And being amazing with one tool doesn't mean you're a master of all of them. Okay, that makes sense. And then you've got the third group, the interaction theories, which sound like they're trying to find some middle ground.
Yeah, they're saying that intelligence is probably a mix of both, like a general underlying thing and a bunch of specific skills all working together. A good example is Cattell's theory of fluid and crystallized intelligence. He said fluid intelligence is kind of like your raw ability to reason and solve new problems, like that think on your feet kind of smarts. Whereas crystallized intelligence is more about the knowledge and skills you've picked up over time through learning and experience. And he thought that crystallized intelligence actually develops from and is shaped by fluid intelligence as we interact with the world. And what's interesting is he thought fluid intelligence was more tied to heredity, like what you're born with.
Wow, so you're saying your inherent ability to like solve problems actually impacts how much knowledge you're able to gain.
Exactly. And Horn, he took this further, coming up with a model with 10 major capacities. And he was saying that they're all related, but not necessarily driven by just one general factor. Then you got Eysenck with his three kinds of intelligence. Intelligence A, which he saw as the biological basis, like what's happening in the brain. Intelligence B, which is how that biological potential actually plays out in your life and behavior.
Yeah.
and intelligence C, which is what we're actually trying to measure with IQ tests,
Mm-hmm.
hoping to get a sense of A and predict B.
Okay. So things are getting a little more complex.
A little bit.
But it just shows how many different ways people have tried to understand what it means to be intelligent.
Hmm.
And it doesn't stop there, right?
No, it definitely doesn't.
There are theories that look at even more distinct kinds of intelligence.
Yeah, for like Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences,
Right.
he proposed 7 intelligences that are pretty much independent of each other. Linguistic, which is all about language skills, musical, logical, mathematical, spatial, which is about understanding and manipulating space,
Yeah.
bodily kinesthetic, which is physical coordination, interpersonal, which is understanding yourself, your emotions and motivations, and interpersonal understanding and connecting with other people. So what he's saying is just relying on a standard IQ test might miss kids who are super talented in areas like music or spatial reasoning.
Yeah.
It narrows down what we consider gifted. Like, you could be incredibly gifted in music or spatial reasoning, but a traditional IQ test, which often focuses on language and logic, might not show that.
Yeah, that really expands what we think of as giftedness. It's like we might be missing out on a lot of talented people if we just focus on, a few specific skills.
That's a key point.
Mhm.
And then Sternberg's triarchic theory adds another layer.
Okay.
He came up with 3 sub-theories. Componential, which is about the thinking processes that go on inside when we solve problems. Experiential, which is how we handle new situations and how we get good at things we do a lot. And then contextual, which is all about how we adapt to our environment, change it, or even find a new one. What he's emphasizing is that we need to recognize and build on people's strengths in all these different areas and also work on their weaknesses. So what this means for these programs we're talking about is giftedness isn't just about being a whiz at taking tests. It's also about how kids solve real-life problems and come up with new ideas.
And didn't Sternberg also define like 3 specific types of intellectual giftedness?
He did. He talked about analytical giftedness, which is being awesome at analyzing, evaluating, and critiquing information. Then there's creative giftedness, which is all about those aha moments, coming up with new and original ideas and solutions. And finally, there's practical giftedness, which is about using your knowledge and skills effectively in everyday situations. And what's important here is that it shows that being gifted isn't just about racking up high scores on tests.
Right.
It shows up in all these different ways, and they're all valuable.
So, with all these different ways of looking at intelligence and giftedness, it totally makes sense that selective programs would have different goals and therefore different standards for who they let in.
Exactly. Because resources are usually limited, these programs have to focus on picking the kids who are most likely to, really thrive in their specific setup and get the most out of what they offer. And that leads us to think about the different groups of gifted kids that your source material talked about.
Right. It mentioned prototypic gifted kids, the ones who tend to excel in like most everything and are easy to spot with those traditional IQ tests. They seem like the most straightforward cases.
They are. They usually do really well in programs that offer a lot of academic enrichment, programs designed for, broad intellectual development. But then you've got domain-talented, gifted kids. These kids are off the charts good in one specific area, like music, art, or math. They might also be pretty smart overall, but a standard general program might not be the right fit for their, intense passion and how they learn best in their specific area of talent.
And then you've got underserved gifted children, which seems like a really important group to think about.
Oh, absolutely. This includes kids from different cultures, underachievers, those whose performance doesn't match their potential, kids with physical or learning disabilities, kids with behavioral issues, and even preschoolers. These kids often get missed because traditional tests might not be fair to their cultural experiences or their gifts are hidden by other stuff. Sometimes educators focus so much on a learning disability that they don't even see that a kid is also gifted.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that giftedness doesn't always show up how we might expect. And then there's the at-risk gifted kids.
Yes, these are children who show they could be really smart, but are facing some serious disadvantages because of poverty or not having a stimulating environment early on. It's really hard to identify these kids, and if they don't get the right support and chances, they're likely to underachieve. Their potential might never really come out or even be recognized.
This really shows how complicated it is to try to find and help all these different types of gifted kids. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing at all.
Not even close. And this brings us to how these different theories actually play out in the real world when it comes to getting into these selective programs. And this is where those 3 programs we talked about are so helpful. It's important to get that there's no perfect way to measure giftedness that works with all these different theories, all the types of giftedness, or even the different philosophies of the programs themselves.
So let's take a look at the Cisco A. Carter Gifted Early Education Program. Their goal was to find those disadvantaged preschoolers in inner city Newark looking for both general intelligence and specific skills, and they really wanted to help these kids do well once they started elementary school. How did their approach reflect these different ideas about intelligence?
What's really cool about what they did is that their whole identification process was about how well these kids were functioning and learning in their own environment, their own culture. They weren't just looking at numbers on a test. They were watching how the kids thought through problems, how they handled new situations, and their smarts compared to other kids from similar backgrounds. This is very much in line with an interaction theory, especially something like Sternberg's contextual subtheory, which says intelligence is expressed and seen within a specific cultural context.
And what did their actual selection process look like?
Well, to reach a lot of kids, they started with a screening survey given in daycare centers and preschools in similar socioeconomic areas. The kids who did well on that screening then took a more in-depth cognitive assessment using something called the McCarthy scales of children's abilities. This test gives you an overall IQ score called the General Cognitive Index, or GCI, but importantly, it also tells you about different areas of cognitive ability, so they could see if a kid had strengths in specific areas on top of a solid general ability. These areas included verbal skills, perceptual performance abilities, quantitative reasoning, and memory.
So it wasn't just about a single IQ score.
Nope. To get in, kids needed a GCI at or above the 84th percentile, but they also needed to score way higher, at least the 95th percentile, in one of those specific skill areas, or score at or above the 90th percentile in at least two of those areas. This shows that they thought both a strong base of general intelligence and signs of specific strengths were important, all while considering where the kids were coming from. And don't forget, their target group was mainly African American children from underprivileged areas in the inner city.
Okay, so they were really trying to find those high potential kids who might get overlooked by, more traditional measures that don't take into account their unique situation.
Exactly.
Now, let's jump to the total opposite end of the spectrum with the Gilliard pre-college program. Their focus is completely different.
Oh yeah, totally different. Their whole mission is finding and nurturing those kids who are ridiculously talented in music. And their selection process is all about that, basically based on a specific skills theory of intelligence. The only thing that really matters for getting in is showing crazy advanced musical ability through a super tough audition.
So no IQ tests or general academic stuff at all.
Nope, none. What you need to do for the audition is crystal clear, and it's all tied to what they teach in the program. Applicants have to play several pieces from memory, often including scales, etudes, which are like technical exercises for musicians, and movements from concertos or sonatas. For violinists under 11, for instance, they even say exactly which composers and types of pieces they should be ready to play.
Whoa, that sounds insanely demanding and super specialized.
It is. A panel of Juilliard faculty judges the kids on very specific musical things: their technique, the quality of their tone, their musicality, which is how expressively they play, their rhythm, their memory, and their intonation, which is playing in tune. And out of all those things, musicality is what they think is the most important sign of potential in music. They even have this network of super respected music teachers who are like scouts, finding talent. And it's not unusual for kids to actually get lessons from Juilliard faculty to get ready for the audition.
So if you're crazy talented in music, that's basically your ticket in no matter how you do in school generally. It's a very focused, domain-specific approach.
For sure. General intelligence, like what you measure with IQ tests, wouldn't really tell you who would succeed in this kind of intense specialized music program. And getting in also depends a lot on whether there are actually spots open with specific teachers. Like, even if you're an amazing trombone player, you might not get in 1 year if the trombone teacher doesn't have any openings for new students.
That really highlights how different it is to identify a general high ability compared to the very specific skill-based criteria for a program like Juilliard. Now, what about our third example, Hunter College Elementary School? They're a public school for gifted kids, and they want to give them a strong academic base all the way through high school. How do they identify giftedness?
Hunter College Elementary School mainly uses a G theory of intelligence for their first round of screening. They use a shorter version of the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale, 4th edition, or SBIV, as the first big hurdle, And get this, they get a ton of applications, often over 1,200, for just a handful of preschool and kindergarten spots.
Wow, talk about pressure. And parents have to pay for this first round of testing, right?
Yeah, they have to pick from a list of approved testers and pay for it themselves, although they do have fee waivers for families who can't afford it.
Okay.
And to pass this first round, kids need an IQ score of at least the 97th percentile on the SBIV.
So, super high general intelligence is the main filter at the start. But that's not the only thing they look at, right? I think this source mentioned a second round of evaluations.
Right. The kids who get past that super strict IQ cutoff get invited to these 2-hour sessions where they're observed in a classroom-like setting. The people watching are looking for all sorts of things, like how they interact with other kids and adults, how they do with abstract reasoning and problem solving, and what they call non-intellective traits, which are basically qualities beyond just raw smarts, like curiosity, how much they stick with a task, and how well they work with others. The kids do different activities like free play, group tasks, projects together, and individual problem-solving stuff.
And are those activities in round two also meant to see specific skills, not just that initial general intelligence measure?
Yeah, even though that first IQ screening is very G-focused, those individual activities in round two are specifically designed to look at abstract reasoning and problem solving in both verbal and nonverbal ways. So even though that high general intelligence score gets your foot in the door, they definitely do look at how good you are in a specific cognitive skill, like abstract reasoning, as part of making that final decision.
So, how do they actually decide who gets in?
They look at that IQ score summary from the SBIV, how the kid did in round two, and what the teachers observed. They also think about the age and gender balance of the class they're putting together. Plus, they consider things like socioeconomic status, ethnicity, race, and any disabilities, although they don't give preference to siblings of current students or kids of faculty. The big goal is to choose a group of students who aren't just academically promising, but also make the learning environment diverse and well-rounded, all while working within the limits of how many spots they have.
It sounds like HCES, while starting with a very G-focused measure just because of how many kids apply, does try to get a more complete picture of each child in those later stages.
Yeah, exactly. That very high IQ score basically guarantees a certain level of academic potential, which fits with their tough program. But watching them in round two gives them valuable insights into other important qualities and helps them build a more diverse and well-rounded group.
Comparing these three very different programs really brings home the point we made at the beginning, that the criteria for getting into these selective programs are all over the place and clearly depend on their specific missions and, to a large extent, on the theories about intelligence and giftedness that they're using, whether they say so directly or not.
Totally agree. And the source material brings up some really important points to discuss that come from these different approaches. For example, why even try to identify kids for these programs when they're as young as 3 years old?
That's a great question. It does seem really young.
Yeah, the thinking is often that if you don't identify gifted kids early and give them the right enrichment, they might get bored, frustrated, and even start doing poorly in school. Early intervention is also seen as a way to counteract any disadvantages that kids in under-resourced schools might be facing. We tend to see less diversity in gifted programs for older kids, which suggests that identifying and supporting them early can make a difference in their education.
That makes sense, reaching them early before they get discouraged or fall behind.
Right.
But then the question is, what about all the other kids who show potential, especially those from low-income backgrounds who don't get into these programs that only have so many spots?
That's a huge issue. These model programs, like Cisco Carter, Juilliard Pre-College, and HCES, while awesome, can only take so many kids. The source material pointed out that kids from low SES communities are consistently underrepresented in most gifted programs, even when there are specific efforts to reach out to them. It says we really need more programs like these in different places, and we have to educate parents and teachers in low SES areas about the different ways giftedness can show up in their kids so they can be identified and supported right there in their own schools.
And this ties into the whole debate about standardized tests, right? Should gifted programs move away from relying so much on them to identify kids so they can find more kids from different backgrounds?
The source definitely talks about the cultural biases that can creep into these tests, even ones that have been carefully designed for diverse populations, like the Stanford Binet, which, as we mentioned, has a big verbal part. A kid's score can be affected by all sorts of things, like how much language they were exposed to at home and whether they had access to specific learning opportunities within their culture. The Cisco Carter program's way of doing things, where they compared kids to their peers from similar cultural groups might be a different model to think about. But using different criteria for different groups also brings up the challenge of making sure all the kids in a program actually have similar educational needs.
It's a tough balancing act.
It is.
Trying to be fair and objective while also taking into account the different backgrounds and experiences of the kids. Another interesting question the source asked is whether the super gifted kids and those who are high achievers in their own, maybe under-resourced communities should necessarily be in the same classes, even if their test scores might be quite different.
That gets to the heart of the huge range of abilities you can find, even within a group of gifted kids. There's this constant push and pull between giving those super gifted learners specialized accelerated instruction and making sure that high potential kids from disadvantaged backgrounds get the specific enrichment and support they need to do well and reach their full potential. The source doesn't really give a clear-cut answer, but it suggests that having really skilled and well-trained teachers who can adjust their teaching to meet a wide range of needs is super important in this scenario.
What about the talent development model that we see at Juilliard, where they're hyper-focused on finding and nurturing one particular skill? Could that work for academic programs?
That's an interesting thought. The Gilliard model is all about showing you've got serious skills within very clear guidelines that are directly related to what they teach in the program.
Yeah.
Maybe in academics, this could mean focusing more on things like portfolios of work, projects that show deep learning, or presentations that demonstrate advanced knowledge and skills in specific subjects instead of using standardized tests as the main way to decide who's in and who's out. But the really individualized mentoring that's so important at Juilliard might be hard to replicate in a typical school setting, where there are way more students for each teacher.
The source also briefly mentioned the whole issue of bilingualism and how that affects standardized testing.
Right, translating these tests can accidentally make them harder or easier than the original, which messes with how valid the results are. Plus, young kids who are still learning English might not be able to show their true abilities on tests that are in English. And this is just another reason why gifted kids from diverse backgrounds might not be identified.
It all comes back to the idea that saying all gifted kids are the same is just flat out wrong. There's such a huge range of abilities, skills, and interests. And we can see this tension between wanting a really efficient way to find these kids, like using G-scores for that first screening, and wanting to choose a diverse class, like at Hunter College Elementary School.
Absolutely. What the source ultimately says is that the best situation is when how you identify kids matches the goals and design of the educational program itself. It would be great to have lots of different programs, each one designed for a specific type of giftedness, like how Juilliard focuses on music. But because there are so few gifted programs right now, we often have to use a more general approach to find these kids, and who gets in might not be based as much on specific theories. The big message seems to be that we, as a society, need to invest more in developing talent in all areas so we don't miss out on the potential of all these gifted kids.
So to wrap it all up, the main takeaway from looking at your sources is that identifying a child with high ability and the process of choosing students for these selective gifted programs are two separate things. And the specific criteria these programs use are based on different ideas about what intelligence is and are shaped by the program's goals, the resources they have, and the limitations they're working within.
That sums it up perfectly, and your initial interest in this really showed how complicated these approaches are and how important it is to make sure all gifted kids have a fair chance to get a good education, no matter where they come from or how their giftedness shows up.
And with that in mind, here's something to think about. Given all the different philosophies and practical challenges we've talked about today, what do you think is the most important thing to consider when we're trying to identify and help those high potential learners? Are we mainly trying to find some kind of inborn talent, or is it more about nurturing specific skills and abilities? Or maybe it's most important to fix the problems of fairness and access that we see in gifted education. It's definitely something to keep chewing on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.